Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, How to Bring Systemic Change to DEI Challenges, sponsored by Salesforce. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and can be submitted for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast is ended. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Sarah Anderson to introduce our speakers.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Bring Systemic Change to DEI Challenges. Appreciate you spending the time and taking an hour of your day with us. So my name is Sarah Anderson, and I work on the product marketing team for Philanthropy Cloud at Salesforce.org. I'll be moderating today. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our two speakers. First, we have Iris Ivana Grant, the founder and CEO of the Genesi Group. She works closely with HR and CSR executives on their strategies for philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, community engagement, and brand awareness. Iris has helped companies develop and restructure comprehensive HR social impact programs and campaigns that increase employee engagement and brand recognition. We also have Alexandra Siegel, who leads our equality, content, and enablement team. She focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion and helps her employees lead with inclusive business practices. She also gives content and tools to our external community to help them reach equality in their business. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I need to remind everyone that Salesforce is a publicly traded company. If and when we cover our products, we advise you to make any purchasing decisions based on currently available technology. So we have a lot to cover this hour. Just want to give you a quick rundown of what we plan to accomplish. First, we're going to talk through the current state of affairs, how we got here, why we're here today, and kind of what we hope to accomplish in the near future. Then we've laid out an equity framework that we're going to talk through, and it has two tracks. The first is the internal track that'll help us accomplish equality immediately. And the second is an external plan for building a path toward equity. And then finally, I want to make sure that we talk about employee involvement and how to get our employees involved in all of these plans. And I hope to leave a few minutes at the end for some Q&A. So if you have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. All right, so I love to start with this slide. This is something that we always talk about, especially with Philanthropy Cloud. A long time ago, maybe not that long ago, Peter Drucker, who's an author and a management professor, he stated that the purpose of business is to create a customer. And that doesn't seem too far off. But in 2019, the Business Roundtable and a bunch of other CEOs talked this through and came up with the idea that a business is more than that. And our own CEO, Mark Benioff, talked about the business of business is to improve the state of the world. And I think that that's just so fitting for the state of the world that we're currently in. And I think that we're all seeing businesses step up more and more all the time. And that's really why we're here today. So recently, actually as recently as December, McKinsey came out with this new report. It's called It's Time for a New Approach to Racial Equity. It had a lot of really interesting and eye-opening statistics in there. First of which is that Black American families have 8 times less wealth than white families. Black-owned businesses have suffered way more than white-owned businesses during the pandemic. And speaking of the pandemic, Black people are dying at twice the rate of white people. These are all just really alarming numbers to me, and I think they should be alarming to everybody. But they also really highlight the difference between equity and equality. And I think, you know, it's worth taking a moment to really think about that and explain what that all means. And I think with these issues in particular, the issue of equity is what really stands out. You know, to me, equity is about the ability to handle all the curveballs that life throws you. You know, it's about having a safety net or a cushion. And, you know, it's not, we talk about it in terms of wealth, and I feel like that's a term that a lot of people don't necessarily relate to. I think most of us don't think of ourselves as wealthy, but a lot of us have a safety net. We either have a savings account, we hopefully have some sort of a savings account. We have health insurance. We have the ability to take a day off if we get sick. We have the ability to work from home, as I think pretty much everybody on this webinar is probably doing still. But a lot of people, especially people in our Black communities, do not have those things. And that is what is making the difference literally between life and death for a lot of our friends in the Black community. And so I think that that's what we're really getting at here, and we want to change that. And it's we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. So 2020 is the year that businesses really took notice of this entire situation. The lack of equity has been an issue for hundreds of years, and yet it was this year, well, last year, thank God it was last year, but last year that businesses really took notice. So after the events of last summer, specifically the deaths and the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, after that, businesses started to have conversations, and employees started to have conversations, and they started to make changes and talk about what kinds of changes that they could make. So of the Fortune 1000 companies, they committed $66 billion to racial equity initiatives. That's a huge amount of money, and it's really important that we are able to focus that money on systemic change so that we can actually see a return on that investment. And if we want to look forward, a lot of times the best way to see how that's going to look is to look back. And if we look back, we'll see that we've actually done an absolutely horrific job of racial equality and racial equity in this country. So specifically, if we look back at the last 20 years, the McKinsey report found that from 2003 to 2018, the wealth gap has actually grown at a compound annual growth rate of 3%. So we've gotten worse, and that it's compounding and getting worse every year, the gap. And then since 1950, we've actually made zero progress, toward income and wealth equality between Black and white households in the United States. So we're not doing it right. Whatever we're doing, it's not working. And we need to figure this out. We have to figure out how we attain a return on this investment of $66 billion. Because not only is it a lot of money, but it's the most attention ever committed to this cause, especially by businesses. And so without a common framework and collaboration among all of the businesses in the country, we will be no closer to solving these problems than we were before the summer of 2020. So bottom line, companies are giving money, but that is just simply not enough. So let's talk a little bit more about what exactly they're doing. We're seeing progress again in terms of the money and in terms of what they're doing publicly, and taking a public stand is just absolutely critical. And we've seen some progress on this front, but it's not enough. So 32% have made statements in support of racial justice. 22% have made external commitments to promote equity with regard to economic opportunity. And 18% have made internal commitments to promote diversity and inclusion. Here's what's also interesting. Investors are taking an activist approach. They're actually, investing firms are more interested in taking an active approach to investing. So 93% of activist firms, or people surveyed in activist firms, agree with that statement. So they're looking at companies and saying, I want a company that is an activist, not just donating money to a good cause, not just participating in philanthropy or being a sustainable, having sustainable products, or not hurting the environment. They actually want companies that are taking a stand, a public stand. But 85% of them think most companies are not willing to do that. That's what they're seeing in the marketplace. And we've seen that too. We've seen that some companies are more hesitant than others to take a stand. It's not easy. What if you come down on the wrong side of a political issue? I understand how that's intimidating when you've got, $1 billion business. but know that investors are looking for you to do that. So I think what's really interesting about this is that a lot of companies are afraid to do it, and yet Salesforce in particular actually has done this quite a bit and is sort of a leader in this area. So Allie, I'm going to start with you. Can you show us a little bit about what this looks like within Salesforce?
Absolutely, and definitely want to be humble here because, while we did take some bold actions, and we were among some of those companies you saw who originally just put out a statement standing in support of the Black community. So it was actually after we did that we listened and we heard from the community, which said, you need to make sure that you're not just committing words, but you're also committing action and dollars. And so we quickly formed a racial equality and justice task force, which is comprised of some of our most senior leaders at Salesforce, as well as some of our frontline employees and members of our Black Employee Resource Group. And we committed to actions across what we call our 4 Ps, which are people, purchasing, philanthropy, and policy. And so on the people side, we committed to doubling our representation of Black employees in leadership by 2023, as well as increasing our representation of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous employees in that same time frame. We also committed $100 million to Black-owned businesses over the next 3 years, as well as $100 million to minority founders. And then we committed in philanthropy $200 million towards organizations that are driving racial equality and justice, as well as 1 million volunteer hours. And then finally, on the policy side, we're working with our government affairs team to advocate for meaningful police reform and policies that address the equity gap.
That's great. That's great. So obviously those kinds of commitments come from the top. The people on this call are probably not the ones going to make that will make the lion's share of those decisions. But I think that that's really helpful for us to sort of see that framework and how it's shaping up. So I want to move on to our general overall framework of equity. These are the 2 tracks that I was talking about. We've sort of laid out a 2-pronged approach here. The first is to focus on, getting your own house in order. This, there's a couple of reasons for this. The first of which is that your employees are part of your community, right? And so you can't straighten out your community until you've straightened out your own house. So let's start there. And then there's also just the idea that you actually have a lot of power within your companies to ensure that that you get on the right track. So that's what we're going to talk about first. And then second, we're going to go through, exactly what you do in your community in terms of philanthropy, access, and supply chain. So first, we're going to get into diversity, inclusion, equal pay, and cultural sensitivity. So when we talk about these things, I think it's really important to, first of all, realize that diversity is something that we have. It's something that is here. It's a fact. Inclusion is what we do about that fact. And then equity is the goal that we hope to achieve. So we throw DEI together in one very quick acronym as though those 3 things are parallel. And I want to point out that they're really not, right? That there's sort of a cause and effect and, all of this relationship between these things. So I just want to point that out. And then I want to talk about exactly how do we define diversity within our organizations, within our ranks and within our business units. And I like to bring this example up because I think it's representative of a lot of companies out there. I used to work for a company that was, it was owned by, it was basically based in India, and then we had headquarters in Jersey City, and then we had another major office in China. So it was, it was 1/3 Indian, 1/3 Chinese, and then 1/3 basically kind of white Ivy League young people from America, but this was downtown Jersey City. So it wasn't exactly representative. But I think if they had been asked to check the diversity box, they would have checked the box. And so I worry that we've got some box checkers out in the world. And so I want to talk to Iris specifically. I want to ask you, how do we define diversity and how should we be defining diversity when talking about our organizations?
I think that's a really great point, and it's a great way to segment from the example of what Salesforce has been doing. When we talk about diversity and we talk about community, diversity can mean so many different things. We often talk about it in the parallel of black and white, but there are so many other ways that diversity is shown. There's diversity male and female. There's diversity with hearing inabilities or sight disabilities. There's age. So there are many, many ways that I think an organization needs to first look at and define diversity. What's missing? Not necessarily by what you have already there showing in the workforce, but what is missing? Because that community within your rank of employees from leadership on down is actually a small sample of who's in your community, and the needs that are in the community, the cultures that are in the community. So as an organization, it's not just important to have diversity across the board, but you want to look at those factors in your leadership at every level of your organization so that you can show, yes, what's my ratio of male and female? What's my LGBT numbers? What are my concerns with different ethnic groups, right? Different cultures that are there. And having those conversations, then that's the next step when you identify what is or is not there, and you truly define diversity within your organization, because every organization sits in a different community. Then you have to really look and have those true conversations with those employees, bringing them to the table, with those leaders, bringing them to the table and having those transparent conversations to really hear from them what their needs are, what their concerns are, because those things are also reflective of the families in the community, the customers in the community, and most certainly the communities in need, both minority with racial and health disparities, but socioeconomic variances as well.
That's great. I think that's really helpful, and I like that you talked about communication and having that dialogue and listening. Ali, can you tell us a little bit about how Salesforce fosters this type of communication throughout the company?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to underscore some of what you said, we really define diversity as reflecting the communities that exist all around us. And so we also need to have a conversation about which communities are marginalized in our workplaces and in our larger society. So in this case, you saw some of our programs that are directed at racial equality, and particularly our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, who tend to be our most marginalized communities in our society and in our workplaces. But we also have these communities, we call them equality groups. They're employee resource groups at most other companies. And these are entirely employee-led groups that are really meant to create a space for our most underrepresented communities. So you can see, for example, Ability Force, that's for people living with disabilities. We have Vet Force, which is for veterans. Wind Force is our Indigenous communities. Faith Force, people of all faith or no faith at all. And so these groups are super important to our culture because, just like Iris talked about, you have to make sure you're listening to your most underrepresented employees and you understand their experience as well as their experience at home, not just in the workplace, and how we can better support our employees. And so whenever we are thinking about how do we design our processes, how do we design some of our strategies, we need to make sure that we're talking to these groups, because when you design for the most marginalized, you design for everyone.
That's great. And do you want to talk through this slide a little bit too about these inclusive promotion principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked about designing your processes. And so when we think about where we can make the most impact, especially in HR, it's really in making sure that our processes are designed with inclusion and equity in mind. And so, we're a very large company now, but if we looked back, we wish we had thought about some of this when we were first forming some of these processes, because now we have to go back and retroactively think about how do we incorporate inclusion into this process. So, for example, promotions, in the last year, we went through a large body of work to standardize the promotion process and make sure that it was fair and equitable for everyone. And so here are some of the principles that we built this standardized process upon. It includes making sure you're evaluating candidates based on the qualifications and skills needed to be successful at the next level, not anything that could be biased, like who they know in the company, for example, or are they extroverted versus introverted. Making sure that you have a nominee pool that reflects your community, so really making sure you have a diverse slate of promotion candidates, making sure that the process is truly fair and equitable, so we have some checks and balances now to make sure that we're thinking about inclusion at each stage of the process, and then also continue to focus on employee development all year round. We know that your most underrepresented employees, they tend to get left out of those big opportunities that later lead to a promotion. So how do we make sure we're being really focused on connecting everyone to different development opportunities?
That's great. So many good points in there. I love the holistic view of this, that it goes from, candidacy to hiring to promotions, and also that we touch on, equity throughout. Speaking of which, I want to zero in on equal pay. I know this is a huge struggle for a lot of companies, including Salesforce. And when I've talked to HR professionals, a lot of what I've heard is that they struggle to even get the visibility into their pay. I mean, they can see what everybody's making, but they can't tell whether or not it's equal. And that even if they hire an external firm to come in and evaluate and do an analysis or whatever, they find the pay gaps, and then they try to fix them, and then they come back and revisit a year later, and they're still there, or they're worse. So this problem is so complex. There's a lot going on. They can't see it. They don't know how to fix it. they're stuck. So I'm wondering if we can, again, I know Salesforce isn't perfect, but I do know we've also spent a lot of time and energy in this area. So can you shed a little more light on this specific, really critical element of our framework, Allie, and how Salesforce has done it?
Absolutely, and I want to give credit to two women leaders who left a legacy here, which are Cindy Robbins and Layla Seika, and they were two women leaders at Salesforce who said, let's look at the data and let's see if there's a problem. And they were super courageous in going to our CEO and asking if they could have the data. And we looked at the data and we found that, in fact, there was an equal pay gap. And I think it was a great leadership lesson, too, in that our CEO, even though it may be a hard thing to swallow to hear that this company that you built may not be perfect in some ways, but he said, okay, let's fix it. And so since then, we've spent over $12 million to address the pay gap, and we do a pay assessment every single year. I'd say that the data is there. You can find the data, if you're committed to it, if it's important, you can definitely find the data, either work with an external firm or data analyst to help better understand, taking a look at people's leveling, tenure, et cetera, to ensure that people are being paid fairly, or at least to better understand the gap. I think the hard part is, just as you said, that this is a deeply nuanced, complex, and it's a systemic problem that is beyond our companies. It stems into society. And so really thinking about, too, our hiring practices. I know that in California, we have a law that you don't ask about someone's past salary, but we actually implemented that in all of our offices around the globe. So that's just one way that you can try to address the systemic issue, but also just having some conversations and training around negotiations and what negotiations should look like. There tends to be some bias against women, particularly in how they negotiate versus we tend to expect men to negotiate. So I think it's really about having courageous conversations about these deeper issues.
Yeah, and it's, as you said, it's very complex. I think, too, you mentioned we have acquisitions on here, and that's actually from something you had said earlier to me, that's also complex. And, even with myself, I am still part of .org, but .com bought .org, and there was another leveling that had to happen there. So how do people work through acquisitions and try to get everybody on a level playing field, especially when they don't have, the same title or things like that? I feel like those are some of the major issues that people are dealing with.
Yeah, I can't say that we have all the answers, but I can say that it has to be an ongoing commitment. It's never going to be a one and done. Okay, we looked at it, we spent the money, we're done, we solved the pay gap. No, we do this every single year. We reassess, we look at the data, we evaluate, and we make sure that we budget to invest in closing the pay gap that year. And you have to understand that if you are acquiring companies, you're also acquiring their pay gaps or their pay practices. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Right. Yeah. And all of their problems and if they've always been asking for a history, that's what their salaries are based on. So thank you. I think that's really helpful. Iris, I want to switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the third facet on our path to equity, which is cultural sensitivity. What does this mean, and why is this also important for overall equity?
I think, again, a great tie-in when we're talking about diversity and all of the different types of diversity that we find in organizations and find in companies. And cultural sensitivity is acknowledging that there are similarities and that there are differences, and looking honestly and transparently at those differences, again, in conversation on every level, and being sensitive to how people interpret information, how they communicate, how they dress, traditions, whether it's faith, whether it's just culture, the difference between Black families and white families and Native American families and Asian families. All of these things make this beautiful complexity that we have to be really honest with and open and be able to share how those differences not only impact us, but the importance of them. So when we bring cultural sensitivity into the conversation, specifically in philanthropy and in corporate social responsibility, it's incumbent upon us to not make assumptions, right? The best sensitivity you can have towards another person is to not make an assumption about what they think, who they are, how they interpret something, or what they even want or need, right? So there's an example that I'll give of an organization that they felt wonderful about what they were about to do, which was a wonderful idea to give computers to children in a specific school to kind of combat against what they saw in that region for the digital divide, right? But for those families in need, the socioeconomic variance is there. Those families were first concerned about how to pay rent, how to pay mortgage, how to keep the gas and electric on, and food on the table. So their immediate need was not Wi-Fi. That was not their immediate concern, right? And so when you look at giving computers, which is a wonderful thing, but if the child takes it home and they don't have Wi-Fi or the internet, the value is, there's a difference there, and those sensitivities just for the economic differences. And I think that 2020 is the year that really made those kinds of issues more prominent. They're not new, they just became top of mind to us because now all of the children are at home, right? And so we're seeing all the different needs, and these wonderful companies are giving and doing. But if there had been some really transparent, honest conversations with just employees right in those communities that were right at some of those organizations, they would have found that variance right there within their own employees, which then reflect the community. So although we want to celebrate the commonalities that we have and some of the differences that we have, cultural sensitivity also is going to lead you to making sure that there's access. What's the need? What kind of access? And having long-term engagement and pathways to that access, right? Not based on what I think or what the next person thinks, but what collectively is shared about the need and our differences.
That's so, I think that's so powerful. And I love the part about just not making assumptions, which is, it's so easy to make an assumption and it's so hard to like not do that sometimes. But I think your story about the kids and the Wi-Fi, I mean, it's an assumption, but then it's also just adding insult to injury, right? It's just making the problem even worse. So I love that. I think that's really helpful, and it will kind of help keep everybody on the right track toward equity. All right. So speaking of tracks, let's move on to the second track here, which is in your community. So when we look at the framework for external work, we're talking, well, first of all, let's back up. When we looked at what's going on internally, most of these changes that we've talked about and most of the things that we've talked about would have an immediate impact, right? They would give you like immediate equality, like people get hired, they get promoted, they get paid, they feel a sense of belonging, and then they excel in their jobs, and that's great. That's what HR professionals specifically can they have power over those things, and they can make this immediate impact. So I think that's really important to think about that as short term, but also, to then keep up with it so that it becomes long term. But then when you talk about in your community, that's where we really have to take a longer view, right? I think especially this year with the pandemic and everybody having to suddenly switch to remote learning, we had to make big community changes really fast. And it was challenging for everybody. It was challenging for parents and kids and teachers and businesses and everybody. So we can do it. I think we've proven to the world that we can do it. But the results in this case are probably not going to be so immediate. And so I think we need to think through, how we're going to make this work for the long term. I want to start with philanthropy. And I think that we often think of philanthropy as donating money to a cause like United Way. They're obviously a great corporate partner. Or even doing like a group volunteering event that has immediate benefits, right? I mean, I think everybody's participated in some sort of event where you get a t-shirt. You maybe, prep food at a food kitchen or paint a homeless shelter or something like that. And you get this immediate little feel-good feeling and everybody gets to bond and it's great. But that's not the kind of philanthropy that's going to affect systemic change. So we need to change the way that we think about philanthropy. And I want to start, I know this seems a little backwards, and believe me, I've gone back and forth on the order of this, but I want to start with an example because I think it's going to sort of paint a picture, and then we're going to get into exactly how this might work. So Allie, you had just a wonderful example that I would love for you to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you remember when we were talking about our racial equality and justice work under philanthropy, we had 1 million volunteer hours towards racial equality and justice. And I just want to highlight this story that I'm super proud of, and I had nothing to do with this, but our Bold Force, which is our Black Employee Resource Group chapter in Georgia, they actually mobilized to use their volunteer time. Our employees get a week of volunteer time to volunteer with registering Black voters, which I just think is so super important. And they used their time to volunteer at the polling stations, and they were integral in some of the changes that we saw in Georgia in this past election cycle, just because they took their time to really invest back in their community. And the lesson I think we can learn from this is that it's not just about money. We have employees at our companies and they all are part of some community. And if we can actually mobilize our employees to give back in a way that can actually drive systemic change, then that's an incredible power. And I think it comes back to the idea of the business of business is to change the state of the world. So I'm super proud of our employees and this group, and it's just incredible what they were able to do.
I absolutely love this story. And I think it does so much of what we've just talked about. It includes advocacy, purpose, it includes inclusion, and it's all geared toward changing the system. It also gets at the root of the problem. So in this case, the right or the wrong politicians in office, and not just the symptoms of the problem, right? Like, let's feed people or give them laptops. And this is a great example of how regular employees can come together to affect real change. It's also an example of a company taking a public stand, which is something else we've talked about, right? That investors want this, actually customers want this, people want this. And yet most companies aren't willing to do it. So I think this example just puts a whole lot of that all in one place, which is great. So Iris, I want to back it up just a little bit and ask if you can kind of help frame this up for us. How can companies change their approach to philanthropy to affect systemic change?
I think that, first of all, I love that example because I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. And so that was just the top of mind and the heated moment for weeks, from December to January. And so individuals coming from a major corporation to have that engagement was phenomenal because, as you can see, when you get involved, changes happen, right? And so I think that's what companies should look at when they're talking specifically for HR departments, when they are looking at philanthropy and you're talking about having employee engagement and employee-led activism and philanthropic perspectives and investments in corporate social responsibility, it's not only critical to look at all the things that we've been talking about, but looking at what's the long-term partnership. Who are we partnering with in the community? What's the long-term game plan? If we're looking to be the preferred employer, what does that mean? That's shaped from the inside of the organization to the outside. So you're giving your time, your talent of your employees that you could possibly match with a nonprofit or a school or an organization that have certain skill sets, certain abilities that they can help train others in the community, especially with young people. Pipeline programs are so important. We often get involved in pipeline programs to educate. Sarah and I, we talked about, bring your child to work day, showing them something outside of what their everyday life is and their everyday community and surroundings provides access. It allows them to see a reflection of themselves in a space that they normally would not. And so when you're looking at developing solutions and partnering, you want to make sure that your organization is in for the long term, right? That you're looking at how you can help with operational and administration costs. It's great to feed Johnny an apple, but then who provides the apple? Where does the apple come from? How do we get the apple from the truck to the store, to the school, to Johnny? Those kinds of things, thinking outside of the box as to not just having the pathway for education and access and economic opportunities for those individuals in the community, but looking at internships. And are those internships then a direct pipeline to an opportunity to be hired at the end of that internship with your organization? And I think HR has a lot of great potential to be able to look at those systemic biases within the organization, within applications, just by talking, again, from the top down with your employees and then with leaders in the community and other organizations to really have a perspective on philanthropic giving.
I think that's great. And we talked about the $66 billion, and this is the place to talk about it, right? Because the money's been committed, it's going. But beyond that too, we've got businesses that are full of incredible talent and skills and expertise. What can those businesses offer up those nonprofits beyond money? I mean, we talked about the long-term plan, but what else? What exactly can they offer up?
Most certainly, human resources is, I think, the best thing overall. That human engagement, that just showing that you care, having those groups come of employees that are volunteering their time. Maybe there's a nonprofit or an community organization that needs graphic designers, and you've got a team of graphic designers. How great would it be to share their talent and their time to be able to help another organization meet the need on a shoestring budget, right? Being able to look at that. So looking at those kinds of types of engagement in every area, and every organization is different. So you've got the best and the most powerful resource of all philanthropically is the human resource, because philanthropy really means love of humanity, the shared humanity, right? I'm looking out for you, you're looking out for me. And so we're having those conversations of engagement, and we're looking with cultural sensitivities, and we're finding out what we're lacking and how we're different. And we start looking at what we have within our human resources and within our pool to make that kind of investment in the community long-term and really connecting. It really has an impact. And that's what we need, is true impact.
That's great. Ali, I see you nodding along. Talk to us a little bit about how Salesforce is doing that.
Yeah, I think, we talked about how every employee receives volunteer hours, a week of volunteer hours. And we also have, with our quality groups, each of them has an organization that they commit to and they dedicate their hours to. For example, Salesforce Women's Network, it's Girl Scouts. And so just like Iris said, making sure that you're not kind of just doing this peanut butter spread of volunteer activities, but that you're actually working with an organization, asking them what they need, and then providing that human resource, which I think is the best thing that we can possibly do.
That's great, 100%. And I know too, Salesforce donates some of its products, right? So we give 10 free subscriptions of Nonprofit Cloud to qualifying nonprofits. Philanthropy Cloud, even though it's sold to corporations, the whole idea behind it is that, we're still contributing to the greater good because we're empowering corporations to get their employees volunteering and connecting those employees with the causes that they care about. So I think there's just so many different ways to think about philanthropy, and I love all the different angles that are going on right here. And Iris, you talked a little bit about access, and I know you have a lot more to say about access, which is also our next facet here in our group. So let's move on to that. What can you tell us about access? Why is it important?
Access is very important in the nonprofit world and the engagement between the corporate world and the nonprofit world and the community. Because when you have access, that can be a multiple of things. It can be a multiple of things because it can be access, as Ali said earlier, to equity and pay. Changing someone's pay impacts their family, right? If you change the income and the status of the woman, she takes care of everybody. So she's impacting everybody in the community. So when we talk about tools and we talk about technology, when we talk about jobs and resources, when we talk about childcare services, when we talk about lunch lines and food lines, we talk about homeless shelters. All of these things are things that can provide access to materials, resources, human connectivity, right? As well as the dollars that we often ask for to help with the processes that we have. And so one of my concerns is when we talk about the $66 billion, it's great that it's being given, but without actionable plans to provide access and grassroots perspectives to make sure that those funds have a strategic long-term provision and plan of partnership, we lose the true access for the individuals that we most want to help and need to help. And sometimes those people, as little as it is known, are the very people that are right in the department next to us or working at the desk next to us. And they may not want to share their personal needs that they have in the community, and they're depending on those resources in the community. And those nonprofits and those organizations, they fill the gap. So that access is really, really important to look at what your organization can provide in human resources and talent, as well as providing partnership and funding for grants or for, as you said, even equipment. It's vital to know what the community is in need of.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I also love this idea of, access to opportunities to explore. And I think that that's something that gets overlooked a lot. And, we talked a little bit about the Take Your Kids to Work Day. And my thought on that is, if you have a child who you want to bring to work with you, but you are already in a low income situation, a low income job, then you bring that child to your low income job, and then that's what they have to explore. That's their big opportunity. And so it's a challenge to, how do you get kids from low income housing or houses or homes into, into arenas where they can see, other opportunities that are outside of their circle. I think it becomes very, very cyclical. Like they can only see what their parents are doing, and so then that's what they become. And so, one thing I did at one of my companies that I worked at was I actually led the Take Our Kids to Work Day event for the day, and we took the kids for like 4 long hours. But they were kids of absolutely everybody from, the admins up to the CEO. And, and then they got to learn about all of our jobs. And I had people come in and present and do different things. And we had a little game and a little scavenger hunt, and they had opportunities to go and talk to employees. And, because I didn't want just, each child to see only what their parent did. Right. And so I think, and then that goes right into our other discussion that you brought up as well with the pipeline, right? We want to build a pipeline in our community so that our companies have employees, right? So it all kind of goes together.
And Sarah, I want to add one more thing. When we talk about the cultural sensitivities, that's such a key element to access, right?
Yeah.
You talked earlier about just having a homogeneous workforce, right? But it's so important to explore outside of your perspective and what you know and what you understand, because philanthropically, that's what we are. We're engaging with those that are not like us, but yet in the human manner, they're equal to us, right? And so we want to just kind of raise everybody's perspective and really provide those cultural sensitivities that we can kind of give them the right access that they need, that they can interpret the right way, right? And they can actively go after and engage and have a betterment of life for themselves.
I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
so yeah, go ahead.
Because this point of access, I think, is so critical too when we talk about HR and the work that we do. Because really, when we talk about equity and equality in the workplace, it's all about access. You know, a phrase that we always hear is talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And it's really our responsibility, if we're not giving opportunities to different communities or different types of people, then we're really not doing our jobs. And we're actually not finding the best talent. And I want to make sure that we never equate equity work or equality work with charity or philanthropy. It's not like we're doing something that's benevolent. We're actually just fixing something that was wrong in our processes and in our companies.
That's right. Yeah, fixing something that was broken. And there's plenty that's broken for sure. I think that's great. And it segues into our next segment, which is supply chain. So, and access, right, for those companies, right? So, Ali, how can companies address equality in their supply chain, and specifically, how do HR departments do this?
Yeah, so when we talk about equality, and especially when we think about racial equality, it can't exist without addressing the wealth gap. And you talked a lot about this there in the beginning and had some really compelling stats. And so every single one of us that works in a corporation, we have the power to help move that along in some way. And if you work with a vendor for anything, whether that is you're hosting an event and you need someone to cater the event, or whoever you use for your training and development programs, you know, really think about your suppliers. And are you always going to the same pool of suppliers? Is it actually accessible for different types of suppliers? So taking a look at your payment terms, for example, a lot of times larger corporations like us, we have very stringent terms that actually leave out smaller businesses. And when we think about minority-owned businesses, just given the systemic issues in our society, they tend to be smaller businesses. And so we really need to take a look at that as well. And then personally, every time that you are searching for a vendor, you know, really making sure that it's from a diverse pool of vendors.
That's great. And I think, you know, you talk about a diverse pool of vendors. Again, I want to emphasize, like, how do we define that? You know, for all those box checkers out there, is it okay? Like, it's women owned, check the box. Is that really what we're talking about, or is there more to it?
Yeah, of course, it's important that we're supporting, you know, women-owned businesses, LGBTQ plus owned businesses, people with disabilities who own businesses, but particularly right now, as we are facing kind of this awakening in the realities of racial inequality and injustice in this country, it is also okay to be intentional to say, you know, we need to focus on Black-owned businesses, or we need to focus on businesses owned by people of color. And for us, you saw that in our purchasing pillar, we actually committed $100 million to Black-owned businesses, as well as all of our other efforts to support minority-owned businesses broadly.
That's fantastic. This has been so great, so enlightening. I hope everybody else feels the same way. Thank you both for your guidance on all of this. I want to talk just a little bit about our employees and how the employees fit into this whole framework, because they're really central to everything that we do. Ali, can you talk through a little bit about how we implement all of these strategies at Salesforce to ensure inclusion across the entire employee base?
Yeah, so it's really multifaceted. I think it's important that you have buy-in and support from the top. So I think we're very fortunate to have a CEO who really wove this into our company's founding and who continues to be incredibly supportive and passionate about driving equality in our business. It also has to be something that your employees on the front lines are also helping to lead as well, because those are the ones who are being most impacted by any of the processes and strategies that you implement. And so that's where those ERGs are very significant, because when you empower them, for example, we give them budgets much like as if they were a business organization or a part of the business. They have elected leadership chairs, they have executive sponsors, and we really empower them to focus on the issues that matter to them or partner with the organizations that are helping their communities. And we also, as I mentioned, we make sure that we deeply listen to them first before we really design a process that's going to impact everyone. And then much like you have on this slide here, making sure that it's process and system focused, that you're addressing the systemic needs and not just kind of, having multiple different programs. Are we really taking a look at our hiring process to make sure it's inclusive at every step? Are we looking at our promotion process to evaluate the same, or our talent review process? Are people getting left out? What are people experiencing? Do surveys. What are people saying? And that's really where you can identify where there are any gaps and if you may need to actually revisit a process, which we had to do this year.
That's fantastic. And I love how this is both top down and bottom up. We see that with Philanthropy Cloud too, that in order for anything to sort of take hold in a company, you need to have leadership driving it and also leadership giving permission for employees to drive it, so that everybody's really, kind of got their heart into it. I think that's just really important. I think we've covered just about everything. I want to thank you both so much. Iris, did you have any closing thoughts for us on this?
No, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that everyone is encouraged to really get engaged, really to have conversation, ask the tough questions, ask the questions that you're most uncomfortable with, right? Because that's where I think you're going to find solutions. And then I love the top down, bottom up strategy, because that's where we find that commonality and succinctness to really have some great strategic planning and engagement that's going to give us long-term impact and results philanthropically, both internally to our employees and externally to the communities that we all serve.
That's perfect. Perfect. Thank you both so much. So before we close off for this part, I just want to let everybody know that we do have the resources that we mentioned here, and there's links for all of this, and we'll be sending out a PDF so that you can all access this. And if you want to learn more about Philanthropy Cloud, you just click on the big white circle and it'll take you to our website. So I think we've got just a couple of minutes for Q&A, so we will switch over to that. Okay. All right. So I have to apologize because Allie did have to step away for another call, but you've all been asking some wonderful questions, so we can jump into a couple of them. I think I handled some of the Salesforce specific ones. Those were sort of easier for me to just jump in and answer as we were going there. But if anybody has any more questions about that, I'm happy to answer. So one of the questions that we had was about, well, we had two that were really similar. So Iris, I'm going to let you just answer the first one, and then we'll see if the second one is kind of the same. As a B2B company, when we define what's missing in our workforce, do we consider what our client companies look like? And then in parentheses, they are not very diverse. How should they address that?
I think that's a really good question, because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and we talk about engagement in the communities, you do want to look at your employees, but you also want to look at your clients, your customers. And sometimes you can also be the source of moving the button, right? Moving the narrative along, that to getting together with those particular companies that are clients and customers of yours and saying, hey, how can we partner together to have more impact? Right? Especially if they're smaller companies, right? So it may be that they don't have the resources. Maybe in their community, they have a very homogeneous setup and design. maybe not intentionally, but maybe that's just how the community is outlined, right, based on the region. So having that conversation and taking the lead, again, it's a top down, bottom up perspective of engaging. Absolutely, you should do that. And a lot of organizations now are leading the way and getting other companies and other leaders of companies, other CEOs, engaged in those very kinds of conversations to look at diversity so that we're all kind of pulling together and doing this in a very harmonious and collective way.
Yeah. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so the next question is about associations, and I assume the answer is kind of the same, that we're an association. When we define what's missing in our industry, do we consider our members' diversity?
You do. And I will say your member diversity is going to be based on the core culture of your organization, right? Because you want to look at who's your target audience. Is it that our membership is only attracting certain individuals or certain other organizations, and why, right? Are we reaching out? Are we having those conversations? Are we being the first point of connection to bring diversity in? So that's more of an internal look of core values and core biases that may be there. I would look at the entire spectrum, from marketing to HR to what our promotional materials look like. What kind of, if you're an association that does educational pieces and programs, are those pieces addressing the interest of our professional body and of our industry? And again, being the first one to kind of jump out there and say, hey, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to engage a little different. And ask the members what diversity is to them. Ask them what they need, what they're missing. Again, that's a place of assumption where we assume what our members want and what they need and what communities they're from. So I think that again is the same thing, that yes, you should be very reflective internally about what your member base looks like.
Ask and don't assume. I love that takeaway. Okay, different question here. How does this translate, I think everything we're talking about, how does this translate to organizations that are significantly smaller than Salesforce, both in activism and supporting underrepresented groups? I know you work with a lot of companies, so talk to us about that.
One of the things that I find is that smaller organizations and companies, it's always that dollar value, what's in the budget, or how many employees we have, or how many resources we have, how many hands-on do we have. And I think that what I always suggest is that you start from a zero budget perspective. It's kind of like having a dinner party and saying, okay, I only have X amount of dollars to invite X amount of guests to have dinner, right? And doing that budgeting and looking at what you have and what you don't have. That's when you have that connectivity, again, to reach out to other organizations and have that shared collaboration of what we can do together, what we kind of can connect on. And looking at your employees are going to be your first pull, because you have no idea who knows who and what access they have to resources, or what hidden talents they have, what hidden interests they have. So when you want to accomplish something, I do believe that employee-driven engagement is really, really key. And that's where you'll find a lot of solutions of being able to have different perspectives and find different ways of getting engaged and being involved that don't have a lot of cost to them.
That's fantastic. I just want to close out that, one of the things that Allie would say, she said this a couple of times before with Just Us, was, when you represent the most marginalized employees, you represent all of us. And if you can make it equal and equitable for them, then you've made it equal and equitable for everybody. So thank you very much, Iris. And I appreciate your time today. I appreciate everybody who joined this call. Thank you, everyone. If you have further questions, feel free to email either one of us. You can find us on the hr.com website. And with that, I will hand it over to Hester to wrap up.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archived recording will be available on the hr.com website within 24 hours. The webcast credit will show in your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send you an email with your credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.